She spent her last coins on chickens nobody wanted, and an entire valley made sure she knew how foolish that was. But what happened next silenced every single one of them. This is the story of Ruby Holloway, a woman with nothing left to lose, who walked into a town that saw her as a joke and walked out as the person they would never forget. If you've ever been underestimated, mocked, or made to feel like you don't belong, stay until the end. This one's for you. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Ruby Holloway rode into Calderwood, the sky was the color of a bruise that hadn't decided yet whether it was healing or getting worse. She sat up front on the wagon bench beside old Dieter Hobbs, who'd agreed to haul her the 18 miles from Mill Haven for $2 and a jar of pickled beets. Dieter didn't talk much, which suited Ruby fine. She had enough noise inside her own head to fill the silence 10 times over. The town came into view slowly, a scatter of weathered buildings clinging to a flat stretch of land between two ridges like something that had been dropped there by accident and never quite recovered. A general store, a livery, a feed supply with a cracked front window patched up with brown paper, a saloon that looked like it had given up on itself around 1887, a church at the far end of the main road that might have been white once, before weather and time and the particular cruelty of high-altitude winters had decided otherwise. Calderwood, Wyoming Territory. Population 400 and some. Elevation enough to make your lungs remember they had opinions. Ruby had heard of it only because her mother had mentioned it once, years ago, the way you mention a place you passed through and didn't linger in. She hadn't planned on coming here. She hadn't planned much of anything in the last 6 months, ever since the roof of her life had collapsed in on itself and left her standing in the rubble trying to figure out which pieces were worth picking up. Her mother was dead. The small plot of land outside Millhaven that they'd sharecropped together had been taken back by the owner who'd decided he could get more for it by selling to a railroad man than by letting a 23-year-old woman work it into anything worth having. Her last $2 had gone to Dieter Hobbs. She had 47 cents in her coat pocket, a canvas bag of clothes and tools behind the wagon seat, and approximately no plan. "You got kin in Calderwood?" Dieter asked, somewhere around mile 12. "No," Ruby said. "Work lined up?" "No." Dieter made a sound that was mostly just air through his nose. "Huh." He didn't say anything else after that. She appreciated that about him. The wagon rolled down the main road at 9:30 in the morning, and Ruby saw the crowd before she understood what she was looking at. It was gathered around the side of the livery, maybe 40 or 50 people clustered around something on the ground, and the noise coming off them was the kind of noise that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck. That particular combination of laughter and scorn that sounds almost like joy until you realize what's underneath it. Ruby had heard that sound her whole life. She knew it the way you know rain. "Whoa," Dieter said, slowing the horse without being asked. He craned his neck. "Something's happening." Ruby climbed down from the wagon before it stopped fully moving, which she would later acknowledge was not her most graceful moment. She caught herself on the wheel, steadied, and walked toward the crowd. The crate was sitting on the ground in front of the livery doors. It was a large crate, roughly 4 feet by 3, made of slotted pine that had been nailed together by someone who prioritized speed over craftsmanship. Inside the crate, and Ruby had to push to the edge of the crowd to see, which she did with more elbow than was polite, were chickens. 16 of them, maybe. Possibly 17. It was hard to count because they were in bad shape. Several were missing patches of feathers in ways that suggested something bad had happened to them, not something gradual. One had a leg that bent at an angle that wasn't right. Another sat hunched at the back of the crate with its eyes half closed, not moving much, breathing in a way that looked like an argument with itself. They were thin in the way that means the thinness has been going on a while. Their combs were pale. The straw at the bottom of the crate was dirty. Standing beside the crate was a man Ruby didn't know, heavy-set, red-faced, wearing a canvas apron that had seen a lot of use. And he was talking loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Been sitting in that crate since Tuesday," he was saying. "Fella brought him in from the oats farm. Said he'd take $1 for the lot." $1? I told him $1's too much for firewood, let alone these sorry excuses for livestock. But here they sit, and now I'm told— He paused, seeming to enjoy the attention. "I'm told somebody actually bought 'em." The crowd reacted the way crowds do when they've been given permission to find something funny. "Who?" someone called out. "Some woman," the man in the apron said. He looked around. "Supposed to be here by now to collect 'em." Ruby stood at the edge of the crowd. She looked at the crate. She looked at the chickens. She felt the 47 cents in her coat pocket. Then she walked forward. She had to push through a few people to do it, and each step felt a little bit like pushing through water. The crowd didn't part. It just sort of grudgingly shifted, and every set of eyes that landed on her took a quick, systematic inventory that lasted maybe 2 seconds and reached conclusions in about half that time. She felt it. She always felt it. The way eyes moved from her face to her size to her clothes, and then made up their minds about everything before she'd opened her mouth. She stopped in front of the crate. "I'm the woman," she said. The man in the apron looked at her. His face did several small calculations. "You Ruby Holloway?" "I am." "You paid 30 cents for these birds." "I did." He blinked at her. 30 cents was apparently even funnier than he'd expected. He glanced at the crowd and then back at her. "Ma'am, I don't know what you plan to do with them, but I feel obligated to tell you that at least 3 of these chickens are probably not going to—" "I'd like to take them now," Ruby said. "Right," he said. "Right, sure." He bent down and picked up the crate with some effort, setting it down closer to her. "They're all yours, such as they are." The crowd had gotten quieter, but not in a way that felt like respect. It was the quieter of people who are watching and waiting to see what they're going to be able to talk about later. Ruby crouched down and put her face closer to the slats of the crate. The chickens nearest to her shifted in the straw. The one with the bad leg made a sound, not quite a cluck, something smaller and rougher than that. "Hey," she said, quietly. Not to anyone in particular. "Lady," said a man somewhere behind her, and his voice had that lazy drawl of someone who's already decided this is going to be entertaining. "You know those chickens are half dead, right?" She didn't answer him. "I'm serious," the man continued, and a few people around him were already smiling, anticipating where this was going. "You could have bought yourself a decent meal for 30 cents. Instead, you got yourself a crate of feathered funeral arrangements." That got a real laugh. A good one. The kind that spreads. Ruby stayed crouched in front of the crate. Her jaw was tight. She put one finger through the slat, and the nearest chicken, a scraggly brown one missing half its neck feathers, moved toward it and nudged it with her beak. Just gently, like a question. "That one there's got something wrong with its eye," another voice contributed. A woman this time. "See how it's looking? You're going to nurse that back to health?" "Better question," the first man said, "is what's she planning to do with chickens when she can't hardly afford a crate to put them in?" The crowd had relaxed into the rhythm of it now. It wasn't even cruel so much as comfortable. The comfort of people who found something to laugh at together, which is one of the oldest and ugliest social comforts there is. Ruby knew she should stand up. She knew she should take her crate and go, find somewhere to put these birds and stop giving these people a show. She knew that, but her knees felt strange, and her throat was tight in a way she didn't quite trust. And the chicken with the half-closed eyes at the back of the crate had opened them a little more and was looking at her with that sideways chicken look, head tilted, and Ruby thought, in the way that thoughts come when you're crouched on the ground in front of a crowd that's laughing at you. "I know exactly what you feel like." "That's enough." The voice was not loud. It didn't have to be. It was the kind of voice that has learned over time that volume is for people who aren't sure if they're going to be listened to. Ruby looked up. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was maybe 35. Maybe a few years older, hard to tell. The kind of face that weather and work and some private difficulty had written things on that made age complicated to calculate. Tall, not performing tallness, just built that way. He wore a coat that had been good once and was now just functional. His hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested it had gotten there on its own. He was looking at the man who'd made the funeral arrangements joke. "I said that's enough, Chet." The man called Chet had the grace to look slightly less pleased with himself than he had a moment ago. "Just making conversation, Wade?" "No," the man said. "Wade?" Ruby filed that away. "You were making her the conversation. That's different." Chet opened his mouth and then decided not to use it. Wade Mercer looked down at Ruby. His expression wasn't pity. She'd had enough pity in the last 6 months to identify it at range, and this wasn't it. It was something more considered than that, like he was actually looking at the situation instead of just reacting to it. "You need help getting that crate somewhere?" he asked. "I don't know where I'm taking it yet," Ruby said, honestly. He nodded, like that made perfect sense. "You just get into town?" "About 10 minutes ago. You got a place to stay?" "I'm working on that." He looked at the crate, at the chickens, back at her. "You know anything about keeping chickens?" Ruby stood up, which took a moment because her legs had started to cramp from crouching. "My mother kept chickens for 12 years. I've been helping with them since I was 7. "What happened to your mother's chickens?" "They went with the land when the land was taken," Ruby said. Wade Mercer absorbed that. He had a way of listening that was unusual. He actually seemed to process what was being said rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. "I have a ranch," he said, "up on the Calderwood Ridge, about 6 miles north. I've got room for chickens, and I've got a kitchen that needs somebody who knows what to do in one. It's not much. Pay is $3 a week plus board, and the board is honest if the work is hard." Ruby looked at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you honest work," he said, "which I'm told is not the same thing." "Why?" He seemed surprised by the question. "Why what?" "Why offer it to me? You don't know me. You don't know if I can cook. You don't know if I'm reliable, or if I steal, or if I'm going to cause problems on your ranch." Wade thought about this. "No," he said, "I don't know any of that." He glanced at the crate. "But you spent your last money on chickens everybody told you were worthless, and you're still standing here defending them. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "Tells me you're not the kind of person who abandons things just because they got harder than expected." He shrugged, like this was a perfectly obvious line of reasoning. Ranch work's mostly about not abandoning things. So, the crowd had gone quiet around them. Not the comfortable quiet of people waiting for more entertainment. A different quiet. The kind that comes when something real is happening and people don't quite know what to do with it. Ruby looked at the crate of broken chickens. She looked at the man who'd just done something unexpected and was waiting to see what she'd do with it. She thought about Millhaven and the collapsed roof of her life, and the 47 cents in her pocket, and the brown chicken who had nudged her finger with her beak like a question. $3 a week, she said. And board. The chickens come with me. Wade looked at the crate. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. The chickens come with you. All right, Ruby Holloway said. She picked up one side of the crate. Wade Mercer picked up the other. They carried it together to his wagon, which was parked at the end of the livery, and the crowd watched them go and didn't say much of anything. Chet stared at the ground. The ride up to the ridge took the better part of 2 hours, over a road that described itself generously. There were stretches that were more suggestion than path, switchbacks where the wagon tilted at angles that seemed structurally ambitious, and one creek crossing where Ruby decided it was safer to get out and walk across rather than trust the wheels to grip the slick stones at the bottom. Wade didn't talk much during the ride. This might have been uncomfortable with some people, but Ruby had spent enough time in the company of difficult silences to recognize when a silence was just quiet, not loaded with anything. It was a workable quiet. She sat on the wagon bench with her canvas bag at her feet and the crate of chickens rattling gently in the back, and she watched the land change as they climbed. Down in Calderwood, it had been brown and flat, and a little defeated looking. Up here there was a different quality to things. The aspens were just beginning to turn, the very edges of the leaves catching gold that the rest of the tree hadn't agreed to yet. The ridgeline to the north had snow on it. Not a lot, just enough to remind you that winter wasn't theoretical up here. It was a plan. It was coming. "What are you thinking?" Wade asked. He seemed almost surprised to have said it out loud, like the question had escaped without permission. "I'm thinking about winter," Ruby said. "It comes early up here." "I can tell." She looked at the snow on the ridge. "How long is your growing season?" He thought about it. "Maybe 110 days, maybe 120 if we're lucky. Some years we're not lucky." "What do you grow?" "Potatoes. Some root vegetables. We had a kitchen garden that produced decent enough, but nobody's been tending it properly since—" He stopped. Ruby waited. "Since my wife left," he said. "About 2 years ago." "Oh," Ruby said. Then because she didn't know what else to say and hated the sound of words that were just filling space. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Wade said, and his voice was flat in a way that meant the subject was open, but only so far. It was a reasonable decision on her part. The ranch was struggling. It was isolated. She'd grown up in Denver. It didn't suit her. Ruby digested this. "Does it suit you?" He looked at her sideways. "Does what suit me?" "The isolation." "Some days," he said. "Other days less." The wagon lurched over a rut, and they both grabbed for the bench seat and then settled back into their positions. And somehow the conversation felt slightly easier after that, the way it does when you've shared a small physical awkwardness with someone. "I should tell you," Wade said, "that the ranch hands, I've got 3 of them, Everett and the Tillman brothers. They're not going to be welcoming." "To me specifically, or to new people in general?" "To you specifically," he said, with a directness she appreciated. "Everett's been here 11 years. He had opinions about who should be running the kitchen, and they didn't involve hiring someone from outside. The Tillman brothers will follow his lead. He's going to make it hard." "How hard?" "He's not a bad man," Wade said, and Ruby noticed he hadn't answered the question. "He's a man who's seen the ranch go through hard times, and he's protective of it. He just doesn't always express that in ways that are—" He seemed to search for the word. "Comfortable." "I've dealt with uncomfortable before," Ruby said. "I know," Wade said. "I could tell." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "You said you could tell something about me from the chickens," she said. "What else could you tell?" Wade was quiet for a moment. He had a way of considering his words that made her think he'd learned through some specific experience that careless words had specific consequences. "That you're tired," he said finally. "Not road tired, the kind of tired that comes from holding yourself together under pressure for too long without anywhere to put it down." Ruby said nothing for several seconds. "That's fairly perceptive for someone who met me 20 minutes ago," she said. "I recognize it," he said. "I see it in the mirror most mornings." The wagon rolled on. The aspens flickered gold and green and gold again in a wind that had come down from the high ridgeline, carrying with it the smell of pine resin and cold stone, and something that might have been the very early edge of snow. In the back, one of the chickens made a small sound. Indignant, probably. Chickens had opinions about wagon rides. The first thing Ruby noticed about the Mercer Ranch was that it had good bones. That was the phrase her mother used to use about houses that were struggling. "It's got good bones," meaning that underneath whatever trouble had accumulated, there was something structurally sound, something worth working with. The ranch had that. She could see it even in the fading afternoon light as they came around the last curve in the road, and it opened up before her. The main house was 2-story, timber-framed, with a wide front porch that faced south toward the valley. The barn was big and solid-looking, better maintained than the house. There was a chicken coop, empty, she could see even from the wagon, that needed new wire on one side but had a good strong roof. A kitchen garden running along the east side of the house, and Ruby could see even from 20 feet that it had gone to seed and weeds in a way that must have happened over more than one season. There were other smaller structures. A root cellar built into the hillside. A smokehouse. A smaller outbuilding that she guessed was for equipment. The whole thing sat in a natural bowl in the ridge, protected from the north wind by a stand of pine in the ridge itself, which was a good choice of location by whoever had put it here. Someone had thought about it. The land around it had been worked. There were clear signs of it, fence posts, cultivated patches, drainage ditches, but not worked recently, not in the way it deserved. "It's a good place," Ruby said. Wade looked at her to see if she meant it. "It needs work." "I said good, not perfect." She paused. "I don't trust perfect." Something in his face eased slightly at that. Then Everett came out of the barn. He was a big man, late 40s, with the kind of face that held grudges neatly. Features that were individually ordinary, but arranged into an expression of settled disapproval that looked like it had been there a long time. He was wiping his hands on a rag, which he tucked into his belt as he watched the wagon pull up. His eyes went to Wade first, then to Ruby. They stayed there. "This her?" he said. "Ruby Holloway," Wade said. "She'll be handling the kitchen and the chickens." "The chickens," Everett repeated in the way people repeat things when they want to demonstrate their opinion of them without having to state it directly. "In the back," Ruby said. Everett looked at the crate in the back of the wagon. He walked over, not quickly, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that unhurried movement is its own statement, and looked at the chickens. They're diseased, he said. They're malnourished, Ruby said. Some of them are both, he said. Probably, Ruby agreed. The ones that are both will separate out. The ones that are just malnourished should come back in 4 to 6 weeks with proper feed and care. Everett looked at her with the expression of a man whose mind has already been made up and is not looking for new information to complicate things. And who's going to provide that care? I am, Ruby said. Starting now. She climbed down from the wagon. Again, not her most graceful moment. The wagon bench was higher than she'd estimated, and her skirt caught on the brake lever, and went to the back to begin lifting the crate. There's a technique to that, Everett said, watching her struggle with the weight. I imagine there is, Ruby said, not stopping. Would you like to show me, or would you like to just stand there? There was a beat of silence. From the barn door, where she hadn't seen them before, the Tillman brothers, 2 men in their mid-20s who looked enough alike to establish they were related, but not enough alike to be confused, had appeared and were watching with the careful neutrality of people who have learned not to pick a side too early. Everett walked over and took the other side of the crate without a word. They carried it to the chicken coop together in a silence that was not particularly companionable, but was at least functional. The kitchen was the worst room in the house, and given that Ruby had seen the rest of the house, the sagging curtains, the floor that needed re-leveling in the parlor, the upstairs hallway with the water stain on the ceiling that had been there long enough to have developed its own topography, that was saying something. It was big, which was good. The stove was a serious piece of iron, a Monarch range that must have been hauled up that road at considerable effort and expense, and it was good quality even if it was dirty. The work table was solid maple. The shelving was adequate. But the shelves were mostly empty, and the emptiness had a particular quality. The quality of things that had been used up and not replaced, rather than things that had never been there. There was dust in the corners that had accumulated over time in layers, the way dust does when no one is fighting it. There was a smell that wasn't bad exactly, just hollow, like a room that had forgotten its purpose. Ruby stood in the middle of it and turned slowly and took inventory. A sack of flour, less than a quarter full. Salt. Some dried beans, not many. A small amount of cornmeal. Lard in a can that was still serviceable. Nothing fresh. No vegetables, which meant no one had touched the kitchen garden in weeks. On the back shelf, 3 jars of what appeared to be preserved tomatoes, 2 of which had intact seals. She found a bucket under the sink and a pump outside that worked, cold and a bit reluctant, but it worked, and she brought water in and built a fire in the stove and found a worn broom behind the door and began. The kitchen had probably been cleaned at some point. She would simply find out when. She was on her knees scrubbing the bottom of the oven when she heard boots on the back porch stairs and then the door. "There's no supper?" said a voice that was younger than Everett's, but had been practicing the same general disapproving tone. Ruby didn't stop scrubbing. "There'll be supper. It'll be late." "We eat at 6, the voice said. "Then tonight you'll eat at 7:30, Ruby said. "The kitchen needs to be cleaned before I cook in it." A pause. "Everett says you're not going to last a week." "Everett's entitled to his opinion," Ruby said. "You're not what we expected." "What did you expect?" A longer pause. "I don't know. Someone more—" He seemed to struggle. "Someone who looked more like a cook." Ruby sat back on her heels and looked up at the young man in the doorway. He was one of the Tillman brothers. She couldn't tell which yet. She'd need more time to figure out which differences mattered. And he had the grace to look slightly embarrassed by what he'd just said, though not enough to take it back. "What does a cook look like?" she asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm asking genuinely," Ruby said, "because I've been feeding people since I was 12 years old, and in my experience, cooks look like whoever shows up and makes the food." The Tillman brother looked at the floor. "I'm Pete," he said, like this was a peace offering. "Ruby," she said, though he already knew that. "Come back at 7:30. Supper won't be fancy, but it'll be hot." Pete Tillman left. Ruby went back to the oven. At 7:45, Mud says, not 7:30, because the stove had taken longer to come up to temperature than she'd expected, and she refused to serve something half done. She put a pot of beans with salt pork and dried herbs, a pan of cornbread made with the last of the cornmeal, and a pot of something she was calling soup, but which was really just the preserved tomatoes with the remaining flour and some water, and such flavor as she could engineer from the almost empty spice shelf. It was not, by any objective measure, a great meal. It was the kind of meal that you make when you have almost nothing and need it to feed 4 grown men who've been doing physical work since dawn. She set it on the table and stood back. Everett came in first, looked at the food, looked at her, and sat down without comment. Pete Tillman came in after, then his brother, Earl, she found out later, and finally Wade, who'd been in the barn doing something with the fence post hardware. They ate. Everett had thirds of the cornbread. He didn't say anything about it. That was, Ruby would later think, the first very small victory. The chickens spent their first night in Calderwood Ridge in the coop, and Ruby spent most of her first night awake, which was not how she'd planned things, but turned out to be informative. She couldn't sleep in the small room Wade had given her off the back of the house. It was a good room, clean enough, with a window that faced east so she'd have morning light, not because it was uncomfortable, but because her mind wouldn't stop running the calculations. How much feed would the chickens need, and where would she get it, and what would it cost, and how long before any of them were laying, and how long before all of them were laying, and was that one with the bad leg actually going to make it, and what about the one at the back of the crate who still wasn't eating much? Around 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep, wrapped herself in the quilt from the bed, and went out to check on them. The night was cold and clear and full of stars, the kind of star quantity that's only possible when you're far from any town and the air is thin and the sky is very dark. She stood on the back porch for a moment just looking up, which she hadn't done in a long time. There had been a stretch of months when looking up had felt like the wrong direction. The coop was quiet. She lifted the latch and pushed the door open and put her head in with the small lantern she'd brought from the kitchen. Most of the chickens were roosting in the way they were supposed to, tucked against each other on the bar she'd put together from a piece of fencing. 1 or 2 were on the floor, which she'd have to address. The one with the bad leg was sitting in the corner she'd made for her. A little nest of clean straw, separate from the others, with access to water nearby, and she was watching Ruby come in with that sideways evaluating look chickens do. "Still alive," Ruby said. The chicken tilted her head to the other side. "I know," Ruby said. "Me too." She adjusted the water container, checked the feed, and made a mental list of what she'd need from Calderwood's general store in the morning and how she was going to fund that given her 47 cents and the fact that her first pay wasn't due for a week. "Miss Holloway." She startled, turned. Wade was standing at the coop door, also wrapped in something, a heavy canvas jacket that he'd clearly just thrown on over whatever he'd been sleeping in. He looked like she'd woken him, though she didn't know how. She'd been quiet. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Neither could I," he said. He looked at the chickens. "How are they?" "Better than I'd expected," she said. "Worse than I'd hoped." She nodded toward the corner. "That one I'm worried about, the one with the leg. She's not eating." Wade leaned in and looked. "She got a name?" "It's been less than a day." "You're going to name them?" "Probably," she admitted. "I know that's not efficient." He made a sound that might have been a very quiet laugh. "My wife used to say—" He stopped, started again. "She said naming animals you're keeping for practical purposes was just making things harder on yourself." "She wasn't wrong," Ruby said. "No," Wade agreed. "She wasn't often wrong about things, just about this place." They stood in the doorway of the chicken coop in the middle of the night with the stars going on forever above the ridgeline. And it was the strangest possible place for a conversation, but it had a particular quality, the honesty that comes with late hours and darkness and the absence of audience. "Can I ask you something?" Ruby said. "You can ask. Why is the ranch struggling? Not—" She hesitated, trying to find the words that wouldn't sound presumptuous. "Not in the sense of what's going wrong on the land. I can see some of that. The garden, the kitchen, some of the fencing needs attention. But I get the feeling the trouble isn't just that. There's something else." Wade was quiet for a long moment. "Gideon Crow," he said finally. The name meant nothing to her yet. "Who is he?" "He owns the bank in Calderwood. He owns 3 other businesses. He controls most of the supply contracts for ranches in this valley, which means he controls who gets feed, who gets equipment, who gets credit when the winter runs long and the cash runs short." He paused. and he's decided that this ranch would be more useful to him empty than occupied. Why? Because I won't sell him the water rights to the Upper Creek. He wants them. He's been wanting them for 2 years. They'd let him control water access for half the farms south of the ridge, and he'd charge accordingly. He said it matter-of-factly, with the flatness of someone who has told this story enough times to have wrung the emotion out of it. I told him no. So he's been making things difficult. Difficult how? Supply prices went up. Feed prices went up. Credit tightened. There were rumors about the quality of the beef I send to market, about my management, about my... He paused again. About my stability since my wife left. Calderwood's a small town. Rumors move fast. Ruby absorbed this. Can he foreclose on you? He doesn't hold the note directly, Wade said, but he does business with the man who does. And the man who does has been getting less patient with every passing quarter. How much time do you have? He looked at her in the dark. You're getting right to it. I'm trying to understand what I walked into, she said. I think I'm entitled to know. Maybe 1 season, Wade said. If things go wrong this winter, maybe less. Ruby thought about this. She looked at the chickens in their coop. She thought about the kitchen with its almost empty shelves. She thought about the garden that needed everything. All right, she said. All right, he said. I needed to know what we were working with, she said. Now I know. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. I'm going to need money for feed and seed, more than I'll have until payday. I can advance you against your wages, Wade said. I'm also going to need the Tillman brothers to help me in the kitchen garden for the first 2 weeks while we get it back in order. Everett doesn't have to help, Ruby said. Just the Tillman brothers, and I'd appreciate it if you'd tell them yourself so it comes from you and not from me arguing with Everett about it. Wade looked at her. You've thought about this, he said. I've been up since 2 a.m, she said. I had time. The chicken with the bad leg made a sound then, not a cluck. Something softer, more like a small declaration of continued existence. Ruby and Wade both looked at her. I'm going to call her Margaret, Ruby said. Wade said nothing for a moment. Then, good night, Miss Holloway. Good night, Mr. Mercer. She watched him walk back across the dark yard to the house, and then she turned back to the chickens and adjusted Margaret's water one more time and told them all, in a voice low enough that no one but them could hear it, that she was going to do her best with this. Margaret looked at her with one eye and then the other, which might have meant anything. Ruby closed the coop door gently and stood under the enormous sky for a long moment before going back inside. She still had 47 cents, but she had a plan now, which was better than money, if only by a little. The mountains above Calderwood Ridge held their snow without apology. Winter was a plan, and it was coming, and there was work to do. The first week on Calderwood Ridge was the kind of week that doesn't ask you how you're doing. It just keeps coming. Ruby was up before dawn every morning, not from ambition, but from necessity, because the stove took 40 minutes to come up to a proper temperature, and there were 6 people to feed before the day started, and the day started early up here. The mountain didn't care about your schedule. The cold didn't wait. The animals needed tending before the men needed feeding, and the men needed feeding before anyone did anything useful, so she worked backward from there and set her alarm, which was just herself, her own internal clock, because she'd never been able to afford the other kind. The routine assembled itself in pieces over those first days. 4:30, out to the coop to check water and feed and make sure nothing had gotten into the coop overnight, which was a real concern because she'd found coyote tracks within 20 feet of the wire the second morning. 5. Fire in the stove. 5:15. Whatever she could make from what was available, which was still not much. She'd gotten her advance from Wade, $7, more than she'd asked for, and she hadn't said anything about that, and had taken the wagon down to the Calderwood General Store on the 3rd day. The general store was run by a man named Otis Fenn, who was around 60 and had the slightly detached quality of someone who had seen a great deal come through his door and had made peace with not being surprised by any of it. He helped her find what she needed without commentary, which she appreciated. But when she was paying, a woman came in behind her, sharp-faced, well-dressed, in the particular Calderwood way, which meant her dress was good quality, even if it was 3 years behind the fashion. And she looked at Ruby's selections on the counter, and then at Ruby and said, loud enough to carry, to Otis, "Is she on credit?" "Cash," Ruby said, without turning around. I was asking Otis, the woman said. And I answered, Ruby said. She looked at Otis. Can I get a pound of dried apple as well? The woman made a sound that wasn't quite words and left, and Otis rang up the dried apple and didn't look like he thought any of this was particularly interesting, which was the right response. She drove back up the ridge with her provisions and a mental inventory of how long they'd last, and what she'd need next and how she was going to make it stretch. The Tillman brothers, to their credit, showed up in the kitchen garden on the fourth morning the way Wade had asked them to, and they were not enthusiastic about it, but they were present, and presence was most of what Ruby needed from them. Earl turned out to be the quieter one. He worked without needing to be told twice and without asking questions, which made him the easier of the two to manage. Pete was the talker, which meant he spent some time explaining why certain things couldn't be done before eventually doing them. And Ruby learned to wait out the explanation because the doing always followed. This ground's been fallow almost 2 seasons, Pete said on the first morning, standing at the edge of the garden with his hands on his hips, doing the inventory of someone who has identified a problem and has not yet decided if it's their problem. It's going to need serious turning. I know, Ruby said. She handed him a spade. He looked at the spade. This is a lot of work for chickens. It's not for the chickens. It's for the spring planting, and for whatever we can still get in the ground now. Kale can take frost. Turnips can take frost. If we move fast enough, we might get a crop before the ground locks up. Might, Pete said. Might is better than didn't try, Ruby said. He turned the first section of soil. Everett watched all of this from a distance, the way he watched most of what Ruby did, not with open hostility exactly, but with a studied skepticism that expressed itself in the set of his jaw and the occasional comment made just loud enough to be heard. She was using up resources that were already thin. She was spending Wade's advance on seeds that might not take. The chickens she was nursing along were going to be a net loss no matter how you counted them. This was his general position, stated and restated in various ways over the first week, like a man checking whether a door is locked by trying the handle repeatedly. Ruby mostly didn't engage with it. This wasn't patience. It wasn't a virtue thing. It was strategy. Engaging with Everett on his terms would mean defending herself. And she couldn't defend herself with words because words were cheap and results were expensive, and she didn't have results yet. So she worked, and she waited, and she tried not to take it personally, which was harder on some days than others. On the 5th day, something shifted. It was small, and it might have meant nothing, but Ruby had spent enough of her life reading small signals to know when one mattered. She'd made biscuits that morning, proper ones, with actual lard and the last of the buttermilk powder she'd bought from Otis, rolled and cut and baked until they were what biscuits were supposed to be. She put them on the table and sat down and started passing them around. And when the basket got to Everett, he took one and bit into it, and something happened in his face, just briefly. The skepticism kind of paused. He didn't say anything. He took a second biscuit without comment. But later that morning, Ruby was coming back from the garden, and she heard him in the barn telling the Tillman brothers that the kitchen needed more wood stacked near the back door before the week was out. He wasn't doing it as a favor. He framed it as a task that needed doing. But it was his idea, and it was a helpful one. And that night when she came into the kitchen, there was a full cord of wood stacked neat and dry against the outside wall. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just used the wood. That was the beginning. Margaret, the chicken with the bad leg, started eating on day 6. Not much, just a little grain, but she ate it on her own without Ruby having to coax her with water-softened feed. And Ruby stood in the coop door watching her and felt a loosening somewhere in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. 3 of the other chickens were already looking better. Feathers coming in, movement less labored, eyes clearer. One of them, a white one Ruby had not yet named, had started following Ruby around the coop in a way that suggested personality was developing, which was either a good sign or a complicated one, depending on how you looked at it. It was during the 2nd week that Ruby began to understand how serious the situation with Gideon Crow actually was. It started with the feed. Wade had placed an order through Harmon's Feed and Supply, the only real feed supplier in the valley, located in Calderwood proper, 2 weeks before Ruby arrived. It was a standard order, the kind he'd been placing for years. Grain, hay, a particular kind of mineral supplement for the cattle that helped them through the leaner winter months. It was due to arrive on a Thursday. Thursday came. The wagon didn't. Friday came and went the same way. Saturday, Wade drove down to Calderwood himself and came back in the early evening with a face that told Ruby something before he said anything. She was on the back porch shelling the last of some dried beans she'd found in the bottom of a sack in the root cellar. Not many, but useful. And she looked up when she heard his wagon come in. "They canceled the order," he said. "Who did?" "Harmon's." He climbed down from the wagon and stood there a moment, still holding the reins. Said they couldn't extend credit for the delivery, which isn't what we agreed to. The order was to be paid on delivery like always, but they said they'd had guidance that the Mercer account was a credit risk and they couldn't hold the delivery. Guidance from who? Wade looked at her. "Gideon Crow does Harmon's bookkeeping," he said. "Has for about 3 years." Ruby set down the beans. "So he told Harmon's you were a credit risk." "That's what I believe happened, yes." "Did you ask Harmon directly?" Harmon wasn't there. His son was running the counter. He was apologetic, but he wasn't going to go against whoever had told him what to say. He tied off the horse and stood there looking tired in a way that wasn't physical. "I've got enough hay for maybe 3 more weeks. After that, are there other suppliers?" "The next nearest is in Grantley, 40 miles east. I can order from them, but the cost will be nearly double once you figure in the hauling." "Then order from them," Ruby said. "Ruby, order from them," she said again, not unkindly. "I know it's expensive, but you can't let him starve your cattle because he controls the local supply chain. If you use Grantley, he doesn't have that lever." Wade looked at her for a moment. "You think like a person who's had to deal with this kind of thing before." "Poverty teaches you to see how systems work," she said. "And who controls them?" She picked up the beans again. "Write to Grantley tomorrow. And write it yourself, not through anyone in Calderwood who might mention it." He did. The order came through 2 weeks later. Expensive, as predicted, but it came. But Gideon Crow wasn't finished. The rumors started around the end of Ruby's second week, which meant they'd probably been started earlier than that and had just taken time to travel up the ridge. The first one reached her through Pete Tillman, who mentioned it in the awkward way of someone who knows a thing and doesn't know if he should be the one telling it. "People in town are saying," Pete started, and this opener was never good, "that Mr. Mercer brought up some woman from Millhaven who was run off her last situation for stealing." Ruby put down what she was doing. "They're also saying," Pete continued, now committed to the telling and apparently unable to stop, "that the chickens she brought up here are diseased and going to spread something to the cattle." "That's 2 lies, Ruby said. "I know," Pete said quickly. "I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying it's going around." "Where'd you hear it?" "Gus Findlay, down at the Calderwood Saloon. He said it like it was common knowledge." Ruby thought about this. Gus Findlay was, she had gathered in her limited time in Calderwood, the kind of man who traded in other people's business the way some men traded in cattle, enthusiastically and without much concern for the quality of what he was handling. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Pete. "I thought you should know." "I think you thought I'd do something interesting with the information," Ruby said. Pete Tillman had the grace to look caught. "Maybe that too," he admitted. What Ruby did with it was not immediately interesting. She filed it away and thought about it. A lie like that didn't spread on its own. Someone had started it, and someone had made sure it kept moving. The stealing accusation was designed to undermine her character. The diseased chicken story was designed to give Everett and the Hands a reason to want her gone. Both were specific and both targeted the exact 2 things she was there to do: run the kitchen and raise the flock. That was not coincidental. That was someone paying attention to what she was doing and trying to cut it off before it took root. She told Wade that evening. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and listened without interrupting, which she'd come to recognize as his listening posture. Still, not quite looking at her, processing. "He's watching the ranch," Wade said when she finished. "Or he's talking to someone who is," Ruby said. Wade looked up. "You think someone on the ranch?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm not accusing. But someone knew I was here, knew about the chickens, and knew enough specifics to make up lies that were targeted. That's not someone who just heard about it in passing." Wade went quiet in a way that meant he was thinking about who he trusted and rerunning that calculation with new information. "Everett," he said finally, not as an accusation, more as a possibility he was testing out loud. "I don't know," Ruby said again. "I don't think Everett would do it for money, but if someone convinced him it was in the ranch's best interest..." He's always been a man who could be talked into things if the talking came from the right direction. Wade said slowly. They sat with that for a while. Nothing got resolved that night, but something changed in the way both of them were paying attention. The third week brought something Ruby hadn't fully anticipated: the slow, grudging, entirely unannounced process of the ranch hands deciding she was tolerable. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way water gets under a door. Not a flood, just persistence, finding the gaps. Earl Tillman started bringing the kitchen wood in without being asked, stacking it in the spot Ruby had identified as most efficient without her ever having explained her reasoning. Pete started telling her things. Small things, local things, the kind of ambient information that would have taken her months to accumulate on her own. Who in Calderwood was reliable, who wasn't, what the weather usually did in October up on the ridge, which part of the kitchen garden drained poorly when it rained. Everett was harder, but even Everett had his moments. The moment that mattered came at the end of the third week, on an evening when the weather had turned ugly. Not snow yet, but the kind of cold rain that feels personal, that gets into your clothes and your joints, and makes you want to reconsider your life choices. Ruby had made a pot of stew from the neck bones she'd gotten from a butcher in Calderwood for almost nothing, slow cooked all day with the turnips from the first harvest of the revived kitchen garden, and biscuits again because they'd worked once, and she was not above repeating success. Everett came in from the barn late, soaked through, irritable in the specific way of a man who has had a bad afternoon involving a fence that didn't want to stay a fence. He sat down at the table and Ruby put a bowl of stew in front of him without commentary. He ate. The room was quiet except for the rain on the windows and the sound of eating, which is one of the better domestic sounds there is when you've been cold and wet and things haven't gone your way. After a while, Everett said, "The turnips are from the kitchen garden?" "First crop," Ruby said. He nodded, just nodded. "But then, the drainage on the east end's going to be a problem once the snow melts in spring. You'll need to address that before you plant there again." He said it like he was complaining, like it was a problem he was registering, but Ruby understood what it actually was: planning. He was thinking about spring, which meant he was thinking about her still being here in spring, which was its own kind of statement. "I'll talk to Pete about it," she said. "Talk to me," Everett said. "Pete digs where I tell him." Ruby looked at him. He was not looking at her, focused on his stew. "All right," she said. "I'll talk to you about it." "Good," he said, and had more stew. Outside, the rain kept coming down, and the mountain held it without complaint, and the kitchen was warm. But the thing about Gideon Crow was that he didn't stop just because one lever didn't work. That was the thing Ruby had figured out about men like him, men who had built their power through control rather than through anything earned. They were persistent in a particular way. Not brave, exactly. Persistent. Because persistence didn't cost them the way it cost other people. They could afford to keep trying because each failed attempt barely dented them, while each successful one gained them something they could use. The letter came for Wade on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a rider from Calderwood. Ruby was the one who took it at the door because Wade was out in the north pasture and she wasn't going to make the rider wait. She set it on the kitchen table and went back to work and didn't touch it. When Wade came in for midday food and saw the envelope, something in the way he picked it up told Ruby it wasn't unexpected. The shape of bad news when it's been anticipated looks different from bad news that comes out of nowhere. He opened it, standing at the counter, read it, and set it down. He was quiet for long enough that Ruby stopped what she was doing. "The bank in Calderwood," he said. "Not Crow directly. The bank itself. They're calling in a secondary note. I didn't even—" He stopped. "I didn't even know Crow had bought it. It was a small note from 6 years ago, equipment purchase, and I thought it was paid down to almost nothing. But apparently it was sold to a private buyer 8 months ago, and the terms were reset under the sale, and now the full amount is due within 90 days. Ruby looked at the letter. "Can he do that legally?" "My understanding of the law is limited," Wade said, with a flatness that held something underneath it, something tight and controlled. "But apparently he can, or he believes he can, which is the same thing until a judge decides otherwise." "How much?" He told her. It was not an impossible amount. It wasn't a fortune, but it was the kind of amount that is impossible when the season has been hard and the supply chain has been interfered with, and you've already stretched your credit in the direction of Grantley. Ruby looked at the letter and then at Wade and said, "Don't give him the satisfaction of panicking." He looked at her. "I'm not panicking." "I know," she said. I'm telling myself. He almost smiled at that. Almost. I'm going to need to speak to someone about the legal side of this. There's a man in Grantley, a land attorney who I've used before. Write to him today, Ruby said. Tonight. I will. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket, which was the right move. Out of sight, contained, dealt with as much as it could be dealt with right now. The timing of this is not an accident. No, Ruby said. He knows winter is coming. He knows I'm already stretched. He's doing the arithmetic and he thinks it works out in his favor, Ruby said. He's probably right, the way things are now. Then we change the arithmetic, Wade said. He said it like it was simple, like it was a decision that could just be made. Ruby knew it wasn't that simple. She'd been doing her own arithmetic every night before sleep, running numbers in her head, looking for the gaps where something might be possible. But she also knew that Wade saying it like that was its own kind of important. You had to decide a thing before you could do it. The decision came first, even when the path wasn't clear. We changed the arithmetic, she agreed. That night she sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, and she wrote a list on the back of a piece of brown paper from the pantry shelf. Not a shopping list. A list of what she knew, what she had, and what she could make from it. The chickens were coming along. 8 of the original 16 were now healthy enough to be considered functional members of the flock, and 4 more were trending in that direction. 3 were still uncertain. Margaret was still uncertain, but she was eating every day now and had started moving around the coop on her bad leg with a particular lurching determination that Ruby found privately heroic. The kitchen garden had its first real harvest in. Small, nothing to stake your life on, but real. The stews and biscuits and cornbread had changed something in the house. She could feel it in the quality of the evenings, the way the men sat at the table longer than they needed to. None of this solved the debt. None of this fixed the supply problem. None of this stopped Gideon Crow from doing whatever he planned to do next. But Ruby had learned something from a life lived in the margins of things. Survival was rarely one big move. It was 1,000 small ones, made consistently, made even when you were tired, made especially when they didn't feel like they were doing anything. The biscuits mattered even though they weren't a solution. The kitchen garden mattered. Margaret eating on her own mattered. Not because any single thing changed the outcome, but because all of them together, added up over time, shifted the weight of things just slightly in a different direction. She folded the list and put it in her pocket and blew out the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark kitchen with the cold outside pressing against the windows and the house breathing around her the way old houses do at night when the wood settles and contracts against the cold. She thought about her mother, who had kept chickens for 12 years on land that was never theirs, who had made meals from almost nothing with a consistency that Ruby had taken for granted until she was old enough to understand what it cost. She thought about the woman in Calderwood's general store, asking if Ruby was on credit. She thought about the crowd outside the livery, laughing. She thought about Margaret nudging her finger through the crate slats. Just a question. Just a small, not giving up kind of question. Ruby was not a sentimental person. She'd been scraped too clean by circumstance for sentimentality to stick. But she understood something sitting in that dark kitchen that she'd understood before without quite having words for it. The thing that kept you going when the arithmetic didn't add up was not optimism exactly. It wasn't faith. It was something more stubborn and less pretty than either of those words. It was the refusal to be the one who quit first. She was not going to be the one who quit first. Outside, the first real snow of the season had started falling on Calderwood Ridge, soft, almost quiet, settling on the pine branches and the roof of the chicken coop and the kitchen garden and the fences and the long dark shape of the valley below, covering everything in a temporary equal white that made the world look, for a few hours at least, like it hadn't made up its mind yet about anything. The snow that had fallen so quietly that first night did not stay quiet. By November it had opinions. By December it had convictions. The ridge got 14 inches in 1 week alone, and the road down to Calderwood became something you negotiated rather than traveled, a daily argument between the wagon wheels and the frozen ruts that the wagon usually lost, at least partially. Ruby learned to read the ranch's needs the way you learn to read a person you live closely with, not through asking, but through watching, through the small signals that told you what was coming before it arrived. She learned that Everett's left knee predicted weather changes more accurately than the sky did. She learned that Earl Tillman ate less when he was worried and more when he was content, which made him an unintentional emotional barometer for the mood of the ranch. She learned that Wade sat on the front porch in the cold for exactly 15 minutes every evening after supper, regardless of the temperature, which was not a habit she understood but which she had stopped questioning. And she learned the chickens. Margaret had fully committed to survival by mid-November, which Ruby considered a minor event worth marking. The bad leg was never going to be right. It had a permanent hitch to it that gave her a rolling, lopsided gait that was almost comical if you watched it without knowing what it had cost her. But she moved. She ate with purpose. She had established herself as the dominant personality in the co-op, which Ruby found entirely reasonable, and the other chickens had apparently decided to accept. 11 of the original 16 were now fully recovered and laying, not every day, not reliably, but laying. The remaining 5 were in various stages of improvement, except for one that Ruby had finally acknowledged was not going to make it, which was a fact she registered without performing grief over it, because the practical world of raising animals required you to hold both the value of a living thing and the reality of its limits in the same hand at the same time. The eggs had changed the kitchen. Eggs changed everything in a kitchen. They were the difference between food that kept you going and food that made you stop and pay attention to what you were eating. Ruby made things she hadn't been able to make for the first 6 weeks. Custards that she set in the cold of the root cellar, egg-enriched cornbread with a texture that was different in a way people noticed without knowing why, a potato dish with eggs baked on top that Everett ate 3 portions of and said nothing about, which by now Ruby understood was his highest form of praise. Pete Tillman, who was less reserved with his opinions, said, on a Thursday morning, mouth still full, "This is the best thing I've eaten since my mother's house." "That's a low bar," Earl said. "It's not a low bar, Earl. Mama was a good cook." "Mama was an adequate cook." "This," Pete said, pointing his fork at the potato dish, "is better than adequate. This is—" He seemed to search for a word and not quite find the right one. "This is a thing." Ruby appreciated the specificity. But the egg production was still modest, and modest didn't help with the arithmetic. The debt Wade owed, Brasil, the note Crow had engineered into crisis, had a deadline that was now 10 weeks out, and the attorney in Grantley had written back with an assessment that was honest, if not encouraging. The legal grounds for contesting the sale of the note were thin. Not non-existent, but thin. He could try to challenge it, but trying cost money that was already allocated elsewhere, and even if he succeeded, it would take longer than 10 weeks, and by then the terms of the challenge would be different. "He's saying we probably lose the legal fight," Wade said. He had Ruby's translation of the lawyer's careful language. She'd read the letter twice and cut through its professional hedging. At least the way it's structured now. "He's saying the law as it stands favors whoever holds the note," Ruby said, "which is Crow. So we either pay the note, which we can't, or we change the circumstances," Ruby said. Wade looked at her. "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She set down the letter. "He's counting on us being isolated. He's counting on the Valley having already made up its mind about this ranch, and about you and not wanting to change it. He controls the supply, he controls the debt, and he controls the opinion. Take one of those away and the structure is different." "Which one do we take?" Ruby had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. Specifically, turning it over and looking at it from different angles the way you work at a knot. Not forcing it, just finding the place where the tension isn't, the place where something gives. "The opinion," she said. Wade waited. "He's been using the Valley's opinion as a weapon," Ruby said. "The rumors, the social pressure, the way people in Calderwood look at this ranch. He's been building a story that we're finished and everyone's been agreeing with it because nobody's given them a reason not to." She paused. "We give them a reason." "How?" "We feed them," Ruby said. Wade looked at her for a long moment. "You want to throw a feast." "Not a feast," Ruby said. "A community supper. There's a difference. A feast is a celebration. A community supper is an invitation. You invite the whole valley, ranchers, merchants, families, everyone, and you feed them something so good they can't dismiss it. And while they're sitting there being fed, they're not listening to Gideon Crow's story about us. They're making their own one." "That costs money we don't have," Wade said. "It costs ingredients," Ruby said, "which I can minimize, and it costs the chickens." He went still. Ruby, not all of them, she said quickly. Not the layers. I mean, the ones we've been buying cheap from other ranches. The culls, the old birds, the ones people are getting rid of. I've been doing it quietly. You know I've been bringing them in, because their feed costs have been on the ledger. He nodded. She'd been acquiring discarded chickens for weeks, driving the price as low as possible, bringing back birds that most people had written off as useless. The flock at the ridge was now nearly 40 birds. I can take 30 of the acquired birds, she said, and I can make them into the meal that nobody in this valley is going to forget. I have been working out how to cook them for the past month. I know what to do with them. She looked at him steadily. And I need you to trust me on this because I know how it sounds. It sounds, Wade said carefully, like you want to make our case using the exact thing everyone's been mocking. Yes, and if it doesn't work, then we're in the same position we're already in, Ruby said. Except we fed people, which is never a total waste. He sat with it. She didn't push. Pushing never worked with Wade. He needed to arrive at things himself, which was occasionally frustrating, but which she'd come to understand was not stubbornness so much as the way his particular intelligence worked. He turned things over. He looked at them from the quiet. When? He said finally. 3 weeks, Ruby said. I need 3 weeks to prepare. And you'll need me to write invitations. Letters, she said. Personal ones, not announcements. You address each family by name and you write something specific about them, something that makes it clear you're not just sending a form letter to everyone in the valley. People can tell the difference. That's 30 families. Yes. He looked at her. That's a lot of goodwill to ask from people who haven't decided they like us. It's not goodwill, Ruby said. It's dinner. People will come for dinner. Goodwill is what happens after. She went to Calderwood the next morning to buy chickens. Not from Harmon's. From the individual ranches she'd been quietly mapping over the past weeks. The ones who had culls they couldn't use. Old roosters past their prime. Hens whose laying days were behind them. She made 4 stops and came back with 22 birds in crates stacked in the wagon bed. And she paid what felt like almost nothing for most of them because the ranchers could not believe anyone was paying anything for what they considered past useful stock. The last stop was interesting. The farm belonged to a man named Horace Gant, who ran a modest cattle operation on the flat south of the ridge. He'd had chickens once, he said, and didn't anymore because they'd been more trouble than they were worth. He had 3 old hens in a pen beside his barn that he'd been meaning to deal with for 2 months and hadn't gotten around to it. You want these? He said to Ruby, looking at her with the expression of someone who expects to be amused. If you'll sell them. I'll give them to you, he said. Save me the bother. I'll pay, Ruby said. 15 cents. He looked at her a moment. You're the woman up at Mercer's place. I am. I heard things about you. Most of them aren't true, Ruby said pleasantly. He looked at his hens. He looked at Ruby. He was somewhere around 65 with the weathered and specifically patient quality of a man who'd been doing physical work in a hard climate for 40 years and had lost the capacity for anything other than practicality. I heard you're feeding those ranch hands like they've never been fed before, he said. I'm feeding them, Ruby said. Whether it's like they've never been fed before depends on their previous situation. Horace Gant almost smiled. 15 cents, he said. But you come to this supper you're planning and you put something good on the table. Here? I haven't been to anything worth attending in this valley in 3 years. Ruby stopped. How did you know about the supper? Wade's letter came yesterday, Horace said. Good letter. Mentioned my wife by name, which nobody does anymore since she passed. I appreciated that. Ruby made a note that Wade had already started writing without waiting for her to organize him, which was a small thing that felt like something else as well. She loaded the 3 hens into her crates and headed back up the ridge. The preparation took all 3 weeks and then some of the 4th, and it was not graceful. It was the kind of work that demanded everything and gave no guarantee. Ruby started with the stock, long-simmered broth from the oldest birds, cooked overnight in the largest pots she could find, and some she borrowed, clarified, and seasoned into something that smelled like the best version of warmth a cold day could offer. She broke down the rest of the birds into portions and marinated them in what she had: apple cider vinegar, dried herbs from the kitchen garden, a small amount of the dried chili she'd found in a paper bag at the very back of the spice shelf, brown sugar that she'd traded a dozen eggs for at Otis Fenn's store. Earl Tillman, who had said almost nothing about any of this for the first week of preparation, appeared in the kitchen one evening and said, without preamble, "I can build you a spit. If you're going to roast that many birds, you can't do it all in the oven." "A spit?" "Outdoor, over a fire pit. I've done it before." He looked at the ceiling in the particular way of someone doing spatial calculations in their head. "Big enough to handle maybe a dozen birds at once. It'd take me 2 days." Ruby looked at him. Earl Tillman had not volunteered to help her with anything before. He'd done what Everett told him and what Wade asked him, and he'd been civil enough, but this was different from civil. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "Don't thank me," Earl said. "I just want to know what they taste like when they're done right." He built the spit in 2 days, as promised. It was a good one, solid, functional, ugly in the right way that meant it would work. Pete helped him dig the fire pit and line it with stones from the creek bed, and Everett supervised in the way that Everett always supervised, which was by standing nearby making observations that were 40% criticism and 60% useful information, and learning to tell the difference was a skill in itself. The night before the supper, Ruby couldn't sleep. This was not the productive insomnia of the early weeks, the kind where she ran lists and made plans. This was the other kind, the kind that comes when you've done everything you can do and now you're waiting for a door to open or stay shut and you have no more agency in the matter. She lay in her small room and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that could go wrong, which was her mother's technique for managing anxiety. Not avoiding the thoughts, but walking through them one by one and deciding if each one was survivable. The fire could burn uneven and the birds could come out wrong. People might not come. People might come and be polite and eat and leave and nothing would change. Gideon Crow could find a way to interfere. She didn't know how, but she didn't underestimate him. The weather could turn. Someone could get sick. Someone could say something that shifted the room the wrong way, and she could lose the crowd before she'd ever had it. All of these were survivable, even the worst one. Even if none of it worked, she had survived worse things than a failed dinner, and so had Wade, and so had this stubborn ranch on this stubborn ridge. She got up at 4 in the morning and started the fires. The community supper was set for midday, which meant people had to decide in the morning whether they were coming, which Ruby had learned from her mother was better than an evening event. In the morning, people were still deciding who they were going to be that day, and the decision to attend could shape the day in a better direction than the evening could. They came, not all at once. People arrived in ones and twos and small family groups between 11:30 and noon, coming up the ridge road in wagons and on horseback, and in one case on foot, because the Abelard family who lived closest to the base of the ridge had 4 children and 1 horse that was in poor health, and they'd walked the whole 3 miles, which Ruby found out only later, and which she filed away as something she would do something about when she had the capacity. By noon, there were 63 people at the Mercer Ranch, which was more than Wade's 30 letters, and significantly more than Ruby had planned for. And the first 20 minutes were the chaos of realization. Not enough seating, the need to improvise with boards and sawhorses and blankets on the ground, the Tillman brothers moving with urgent inefficiency, while Everett directed traffic with the authority of a man who has found his natural purpose. Ruby stayed at the fire. She didn't work the crowd. She didn't go out and introduce herself and make speeches. She tended the spit and the indoor stove and the pots of broth and the roasting vegetables that Pete was handling under her direction. And she focused on the food because the food was the argument and no other argument she could make was going to land the same way. She heard Gideon Crow before she saw him. His voice was the kind that carried, not loud exactly, but projected. The voice of a man who had learned that other people listened when he spoke and had arranged his vocal habits accordingly. He'd arrived in a good buggy with a younger man she didn't recognize, and he was moving through the assembled guests with the ease of someone who owns a room even when the room is outdoors and doesn't belong to him. Ruby watched him from across the yard. He was heavy-set, well-dressed for Calderwood, somewhere in his early 50s with silver at his temples in a way that probably served him well in his financial dealings. The kind of man who looks like money even before he opens his mouth to tell you he has it. He moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who has never walked into a situation that didn't ultimately go his way. He hadn't been invited. Ruby knew that because she'd seen every letter Wade had written. His name was not on any of them. Someone had told him about the supper and he'd decided to come anyway, which told her something important. He wasn't worried. He was here because he thought this was amusing. He thought it was an opportunity. not a threat. She went back to the fire, to the musket. The food went out at noon. The whole complicated production of it, carried by everyone available, including Horace Gant, who had arrived early and quietly appointed himself assistant without being asked. And it covered 3 long board tables set end to end in the yard, and it smelled like what it was, which was everything Ruby knew how to do deployed at once. Roasted chicken in 4 preparations. The spitbirds glazed in the apple cider reduction, a braised version with the dried chili and onion and preserved tomato, a simple herb-roasted version for the people who would be suspicious of anything complicated, and a slow-cooked version that had been going since midnight in the big covered pot, until the meat fell from the bone and the liquid around it had become something close to a sauce without Ruby calling it one. Alongside, roasted root vegetables from the kitchen garden, cornbread in 2 variations, a potato dish that had expanded from the version she'd made for the hands, 3 kinds of preserved pickle from the root cellar stores. The crowd moved to the food, and then Gideon Crow raised his voice. "I have to say," he said, standing to one side of the tables, and his tone was the specific tone of a man who is being generous about something he finds ridiculous. "This is a brave effort." He looked around at the crowd with a smile that invited them to share his amusement. "Feeding the valley with chickens from the discard pile. There's a kind of poetry to it, don't you think?" Some people laughed. Not many. Maybe 4 or 5. The ones who were close to him or who owed him enough that their laughter was reflexive. The rest of the crowd had gone a little still in the way crowds do when someone says something that could go in 2 directions and everyone is waiting to see which one it goes. Crow continued, warmed by his own performance. "I hear this is the woman who spent her last coins on broken birds in front of the livery." He looked directly at Ruby now, across the yard. "A charitable story. One admires the ambition, but I'd remind our neighbors that ambition without capital tends to end in exactly one way." He smiled pleasantly. "I do hope the food's edible, at least." Ruby looked at him. She was holding a serving spoon, which was an absurd prop for the moment she was standing in. But there it was. She walked to the nearest table. She picked up a plate. She served herself from the braised pot, the one with the chili and the tomato, the most complex preparation, the one that had the longest cooking time and the most she was betting on. She stood where everyone could see her and she ate it. Not performatively. She wasn't trying to make a show of it. She just ate the way you eat something you've been cooking for 3 weeks in your head and 2 days in actuality, tasting it properly for the first time because you can't really taste what you're making while you're making it. Not until it's done and plated and in front of you. It was good. It was genuinely, solidly good. Not perfect, because the dried chili was slightly uneven, and one of the spitbirds had cooked faster than the others and been slightly overdone on one side, but good in the way that mattered, which was the way that said this was made with skill and intention, and you should pay attention to it. She looked out at the crowd. "Judge for yourselves," she said, simply. The crowd moved to the food. For 10 minutes, nothing much happened except eating. And eating crowds have a particular sound, a gradual settling, the quiet of attention turned inward, which is the best thing a cook can achieve. Gideon Crow stood to the side looking at his plate with an expression that cost him something. Ruby could see it from across the yard. It was an old woman who spoke first. Ruby had noticed her when she arrived. She'd come in a small wagon driven by a boy who must have been her grandson, and she moved slowly with a cane, and she was clearly old enough that the journey had cost her something, and she'd come anyway, which meant she'd had a reason. She was seated at the end of the longest table, and she'd been eating carefully and quietly and watching Ruby the whole time with an expression Ruby had classified as evaluation and left alone. Now she set down her fork and she looked at Gideon Crow and she said, in a voice that was old but had clearly been strong once, and still had the structural memory of that strength. "Gideon, sit down and eat your food." The crowd went quiet. "Sit down," the woman said again. "You're making a fool of yourself in front of people who can see it." Crow's pleasant expression curdled at the edges. "Mrs. Aldrin—" "Don't Mrs. Aldrin me," she said. "I'm 81 years old, and I've been watching you manage this valley for 15 years, and I'm tired of the noise of it." She looked around the table. At Horace Gant, at the Abelard family, at people Ruby didn't know yet, but was beginning to place. This girl's mother came to my door in the winter of 1879 when I had 7 sick people in my house, and no way to feed them, and she cooked for 3 days straight from almost nothing, and 3 of those people are alive today because of what she did. The old woman's voice was even, not performing emotion, just saying the thing. I never paid her properly. I never told people what she did. And I let her daughter stand in front of the livery last month while half this town laughed at her, and I didn't say a word because I'd been quiet about it so long I didn't know how to start. She picked up her fork. This food is extraordinary, and she came by it honestly, the way her mother came by everything. Now sit down and eat, Gideon, or leave, because I'm done listening to you. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like the silence after a truth gets said that everyone knew and nobody had wanted to be the one to say it. Crow sat down. He didn't eat much. Around Ruby, the conversation restarted. Not the polite, nothing conversation of strangers trying to find common ground, but something more real. The way conversations get after something true has been said and cleared the air of all the false things. Horace Gant was talking to a rancher Ruby didn't know. The Abelard children were chasing each other around the fire pit in the safe, chaotic way of children who've been sitting politely for too long and been released. Pete Tillman was somehow already making friends with people he'd never met, which was Pete's particular talent. Wade appeared at Ruby's elbow. She hadn't noticed him approach, which told her she'd been more absorbed in watching the crowd than she'd realized. Mrs. Aldrin, he said quietly. Who is she? Clara Aldrin. She's been in this valley longer than anyone still living. Her opinion, he paused, her opinion carries a different kind of weight than most. She knew my mother, Ruby said. I heard, Wade said. I didn't know that. Neither did I, Ruby said. She looked across the yard at Clara Aldrin, who was eating her food with the unhurried attention of someone who had decided long ago to take pleasure in things that deserved it. As Ruby watched, the old woman looked up and found her eyes across the distance, and she gave the smallest possible nod. Not a bow, nothing like that, just a recognition. A thing acknowledged. Ruby looked away first because her eyes were doing something she didn't want anyone to see. It worked, Wade said. Not yet, Ruby said. We fed them. That's all we've done so far. The debt's still there. Crow's still. I know, Wade said. I know. But look at this. He gestured, not at anything specific, just at all of it. The yard full of people, the empty platters, the sound of actual conversation at the Mercer Ranch for the first time in years. Look at what you made. Ruby looked. She looked at all of it. The whole complicated, imperfect, slightly overcooked on one side reality of what 3 weeks of work and borrowed pots and an outdoor spit and 30 broken chickens had produced. We still have to deal with Crow, she said. We will, Wade said, with a certainty that surprised her coming from him. Usually, his certainty was quieter than this. But right now, look at what you made. Ruby Holloway looked at what she'd made, and somewhere in the warm noise of 63 people eating something she'd cooked, in a yard that had been empty and defeated-looking 4 months ago, Clara Aldrin was telling a story about a winter a long time past to the people sitting near her, and the story was about Ruby's mother, and the people were listening, and the truth that had been buried under years of silence and shame, and the particular forgetfulness that comfort produces, was moving through the crowd like heat moves through a cold room, slowly, but inevitably, warming everything it touched. Outside the ranch fence, in his expensive buggy, Gideon Crow sat alone and watched, and for the first time in a very long while, he did not look like a man who was certain how things were going to go. Gideon Crow did not accept defeat the way a reasonable man accepts weather, as a thing that happens and passes and leaves the ground changed but manageable. He accepted it the way a man accepts an insult to his standing, which is to say he didn't accept it at all. He cataloged it. He held it close where it could stay warm and useful. The week after the community supper, 3 things happened in quick succession that told Ruby the situation had shifted from slow pressure to something faster and more deliberate. Wade's account at the Calderwood Bank was frozen without formal notice. He found out when he tried to withdraw cash for the Grantley feed order, and the teller, a young man named Silas Pratt, who had the pinched look of someone doing something he knew was wrong, told him there was a hold on the account pending review. No letter. No explanation. Just the quiet administrative violence of a closed window. 2 days later, a man from the Territorial Land Office came up the Ridge Road with papers that claimed there was an unresolved survey dispute on the northern boundary of the Mercer property. A dispute that, as far as Wade knew, had been settled 8 years ago. The paperwork was real. The dispute had existed. The resolution, however, seemed to have developed gaps in the official record that hadn't been there before. The third thing was smaller, but in some ways the most telling. Otis Fenn at the general store told Ruby quietly when she came in for supplies that he'd been visited by a man representing Crow's interests, who suggested that extending credit to anyone associated with the Mercer Ranch would be looked at unfavorably. Otis told her this while bagging her cornmeal, in the flat tone of a man reporting facts rather than making accusations. "He can suggest whatever he likes," Otis said. "You're a cash customer. I'm telling you so, you know." "Thank you, Otis," Ruby said. "Don't thank me. Buy more cornmeal." She drove back up the ridge with her provisions and a cold clarity that had replaced the warmer feeling of the supper's success. Success, she understood, had a cost she hadn't fully priced in. She'd moved the Valley's opinion, but she'd also moved Crow from patient to urgent. And an urgent Crow was more dangerous than a patient one because patience had been his discipline, and without it, he was going to start making decisions based on anger instead of calculation. And angry, powerful men made moves that were harder to predict. She told Wade everything that evening. He sat at the kitchen table and listened with the stillness she'd learned to read as contained alarm. Not panic, but the feeling underneath panic that you feel when you understand clearly how much trouble you're in. "The bank account," he said. "That's Harlan Deeds. He runs the bank. He's been Crow's man for years, but I always thought he had enough independence to—" He stopped. "I was wrong about that. The survey dispute," Ruby said. "The records were altered. You don't know that. Someone removed the resolution documents from the territorial office. The dispute existed 8 years ago and was resolved, and now the resolution is gone. What else would you call it?" Wade was quiet. "Calling it fraud and proving it are different things." "I know," Ruby said. "That's what we have to work on." She looked at her hands on the table. "I need to see the original records. Not the territorial office copies. Those have been touched. The originals. Who would have kept copies at the time?" "The surveyor," Wade said slowly. "Bertram Wick. He did the original survey and the resolution. He keeps his own records. He's particular about it, always has been. He lives out past the Gantley Road, about 12 miles. I'll go tomorrow." "Ruby, I'll go tomorrow," she said again. Not aggressively, just with the particular steadiness that had become her default register when she'd made up her mind. Wade looked at her for a moment. "You can't go alone. The road out to Wick's is rough, and you don't know it." "Then come with me," she said, "or send Earl." "I'll come with you," he said. They went the next morning, before the light had fully committed to the day, the wagon moving through cold air that bit at the exposed skin of Ruby's hands and face and didn't apologize for it. Wade drove. Ruby sat beside him and didn't talk much, which he'd learned to recognize as her thinking posture. Bertram Wick was 70-something, lived alone in a house that was essentially a filing system with rooms attached, and received them with the wary hospitality of a man who doesn't often have visitors and has mixed feelings about the ones he gets. He was small and precise and had the extraordinary eyebrows of very old men, white and dramatic and completely at odds with the careful modesty of everything else about him. He listened to what Wade told him. He did not interrupt. When Wade finished, Wick went to his filing system, which was 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelves organized in a scheme that only he fully understood, but which he navigated without hesitation, and pulled a bound ledger from a shelf, opened it on the table, and turned it to face them. Mercer North Boundary Survey, 1871. Resolution of Dispute, 1874. His finger moved across the page. Signatures, both parties, witnessed by the county clerk at the time, who was a man named Arthur Hollins. He looked at Wade over the top of the ledger. "You want a copy?" "Yes, Wade said. "It'll take me an hour." "We'll wait," Ruby said. While Wick copied, Ruby looked around the shelves and noticed something. "Mr. Wick," she said carefully, "when you do a survey, do you keep records of the instruments used, the measurements, the calculations?" Wick glanced up from his copying. "Of course. A survey is only as good as its methodology. Anyone who tells you different is not a surveyor, they're a guesser with a stick. Would you have those for the Harmon Feed Supply lot in Calderwood? And for the Calderwood Bank building? Wick's eyebrows moved. They were capable of considerable expression. Why those specifically? Because both properties were originally ranching land that changed hands in the last 15 years, Ruby said. And because I've been told by a man who used to work at the bank that the property lines on the bank's eastern lot were recorded differently when the building was constructed than what the original land grants show. Wade looked at her. She hadn't told him this part. She'd been holding it until she knew if it was real. Who told you that? Wick said. A bank clerk named Silas Pratt. Indirectly, he didn't know he was telling me. He mentioned the eastern lot boundary in the context of something else, and then stopped, like he'd said more than he meant to. She paused. I think there's a discrepancy in those land records. I think Crow has been filing false surveys to acquire property he wasn't entitled to, or to consolidate boundaries in ways that aren't legal. Wick looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up very slowly, with the deliberate movement of a man whose joints had developed strong opinions about fast changes of position, and he went to another section of shelving. He pulled 5 ledgers. He spent 40 minutes going through them at the table while Ruby and Wade sat in silence, and the sound in the room was just the turning of pages and the occasional scratch of Wick's pencil making notes in the margins of his own copies. Finally, he sat back. There are 3 properties, he said. The bank eastern lot, the Harmon Supply rear parcel, and a residential lot on the north end of Calderwood's main road. In each case, the survey on file at the territorial office shows different boundary coordinates than my original measurements. He put his pencil down. My measurements were correct. I don't make errors of this kind. These records were changed after the fact. Can you prove that? Ruby said. I can demonstrate it, he said. I can show my original field notes, which predate the filed surveys by months in each case, and I can show the mathematical inconsistencies in the filed versions that would indicate they were produced without actual on-site measurement. He looked at them both over those remarkable eyebrows. This is a serious allegation to make. I know, Ruby said, and these properties, if the surveys are fraudulent, that changes who legally owns parts of them. I know that too. Gideon Crow is not a man who will respond to this quietly. Mr. Wick, Ruby said, he's already responding. He's frozen our bank account. He's manufactured a survey dispute on our property, and he's been systematically trying to destroy this ranch for 2 years. Whatever response he has left, I'd rather meet it with evidence than without it. Wick looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wade. She's right, he said, like he'd been hoping she wasn't and had to concede it. Usually, Wade said. Wick went back to his copying. Before they left, he had prepared for them a full set of copied records. The Mercer boundary resolution, his original field notes for all 3 disputed properties, and a written statement in his precise, careful hand explaining the methodology of surveying and the specific ways in which the filed territorial records could not have been produced from actual measurement. It was not dramatic. It was thorough. Who do we take this to? Ruby asked in the wagon on the way back. The afternoon had gotten cold in a serious way. The sky doing the specific thing it did before snow, when it went very white and flat and the light changed quality. That's the problem, Wade said. The county judge is Harlan Deed's brother-in-law. Of course he is. The territorial governor's office is the right authority for something like this, but getting to them... Clara Aldrin, Ruby said. Wade looked at her. She's been in this valley 81 years, Ruby said. She knows everyone who's ever mattered. She stood up in front of 60 people and said what she said without asking anyone's permission. She's not afraid of Crow, and she's not beholden to him. She paused. And she knew my mother. They went to Clara Aldrin's house the next morning. It was a small house, well-maintained, with the particular tidiness of someone who has lived alone long enough to have their space exactly the way they want it. Clara received them in a sitting room that was warm and slightly cluttered with the accumulated objects of a very long life, and poured them coffee without asking if they wanted it, which Ruby found she did. She listened to everything. She looked at the documents. She asked 3 questions, all precise, all aimed at the exact places where the argument was weakest, and Ruby answered them as honestly as she could, including the one that required her to admit they didn't yet have proof that Crow personally directed the record alterations, only that the alterations benefited him and aligned with his documented pattern of behavior. That's thin, Clara said. I know, Ruby said. But it's not nothing. No, Clara agreed. It's not nothing. She set the documents down on the table and picked up her coffee and looked out the window for a moment. Silas Pratt, the bank clerk. He didn't say anything directly. I know Silas Pratt, Clara said. His grandmother was a friend of mine. He's a good young man who has been in a bad situation for 3 years and doesn't know how to get out of it. She looked at Ruby. Would it help to have him say formally what he knows? Ruby set down her coffee cup. It would change everything. Then let me talk to him, Clara said. Don't you go near him. Crow will be watching you. I'm an 81-year-old woman and nobody watches me because nobody thinks I'm doing anything, which has been the most useful thing about getting old. She met with Silas Pratt 2 days later. Ruby didn't know what was said. She didn't ask. What she knew was that on a Wednesday evening, Clara sent her grandson to the Ridge with a note that said only, "He'll talk. Set the hearing." The public hearing was not a legal proceeding. It wasn't a trial. It was a community meeting of the kind that the Calderwood Valley used for land disputes and civic matters, conducted before a panel of 3 respected community members. Horace Gant was one of them, which Ruby had not arranged but was quietly grateful for, and open to anyone who wanted to attend. Crow knew about it. Of course he knew. He showed up with a lawyer from out of town, a sharp-dressed man who looked like he'd been brought in specifically to make things seem more official and more intimidating than they were. And he sat at one side of the front of Calderwood's meeting hall. The church was bigger, but the meeting hall was more appropriate, with the contained confidence of a man who has been through proceedings like this before and understands them to be theater, which this one was, except the story being performed was different from the one he'd rehearsed. The hall was full. Ruby had not expected it to be this full. Horace Gant opened the proceedings with the unhurried directness of a man who runs cattle and has no patience for preamble. He stated the matter. Questions had been raised about certain land records and banking practices in the valley, and the community had a right to hear them. Bertram Wick spoke first. He spoke for 20 minutes, and it was the driest 20 minutes Ruby had sat through since the time her mother had made her listen to a circuit preacher who had confused length with meaning, but it was exact and it was documented, and when he finished there was a particular quality of silence in the room that meant people had understood it. Then Silas Pratt stood up. He was young, maybe 25, slight, with the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that the carrying had changed his posture. He stood at the front of the room, and he didn't look at Gideon Crow, and he said, in a voice that started quiet and steadied as it went, that he had personally been directed by Crow to file amended records with the territorial office on 3 separate occasions, that he had been told these were corrections to clerical errors, and that it was only later, when he had occasion to compare the original surveys with the filed versions, that he understood what had actually been done. He said that the cattle scale records at Harmon's had been adjusted, not the weights themselves, the records of weights, so that ranchers selling cattle through Crow's intermediary arrangements were being credited for animals lighter than their cattle actually were. It was a small adjustment per animal. Across 300 transactions over 6 years, it was not small. He said he had the original ledger pages. He produced them. Crow's lawyer stood up and said several things in rapid succession, all of which were various formulations of the argument that this was hearsay, an improper process, and inadmissible under territorial law. And Horace Gant listened to all of it and then said, in the measured tone of a man who has heard a lot of noise in his life and learned to wait it out, "This isn't a court, Mr. Whatever your name is. This is a community meeting. Sit down." The lawyer sat down. Crow didn't sit down. He stood up and he looked at the room and he said, in that carried, projected voice of his, "This is a manufactured attack on my reputation by a woman who arrived in this valley with nothing and has been looking for someone to blame for that ever since." He looked directly at Ruby. Ruby was sitting in the 3rd row next to Clara Aldrin, who had her cane across her knees and was watching Crow with an expression of absolute patience. The patience of someone who has waited a very long time for a specific moment and is experiencing the satisfaction of its arrival. Ruby did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Gideon Crow and said, at a volume that carried in the quiet room, "Your name is on the amended filing documents, Mr. Crow. Not Silas Pratt's. Not anyone else's. Yours." She watched his face. She watched the moment when he understood that Silas had given them more than testimony. He'd given them the actual paperwork. "The panel has copies," Ruby said. Bertram Wick has the originals." The room went very quiet. Crow's lawyer leaned over and said something in his ear, low and fast. Whatever it was, Crow didn't seem to find it helpful. His face had done something complicated. The pleasant confidence had gone, and underneath it was something harder and less controlled. And for the first time, Ruby saw in him what she'd suspected was there all along. Not the ease of a man who had earned his position, but the tightness of a man who had built his position from other people's losses and had always known, somewhere underneath everything, that this was the kind of building that has no real foundation. Horace Gant said the panel would review the documents and make a recommendation to the Territorial Land Office and the appropriate banking authority within the week. He said the foreclosure proceedings against the Mercer Ranch were suspended pending that review. He said this in the same tone he'd said everything else, matter of fact, without theater, and it landed harder for the lack of drama. The meeting ended. People moved toward the doors with the particular energy of a crowd that has witnessed something and needs to talk about it, the way energy has to move somewhere after a long contained pressure releases. Ruby stayed seated until most people had gone. Claire Aldrin sat beside her, not moving either, which Ruby appreciated in a way she couldn't have explained precisely. "He's going to try something else," Ruby said quietly. "Probably," Clara said. "The territorial process takes time. He still has influence with people who have influence over that process." "Yes," Clara said, "but he had something more important than influence before today." She watched the last few people file out. He had the Valley's assumption that he was untouchable. That assumption is gone now. And without it, the influence is just a man asking for favors that other people are going to think twice about granting. Ruby looked at the empty room. The chairs still in their rows, the lamplight slightly uneven where one of the sconces had a lower wick than the others. The ordinary, imperfect, completely undramatic setting of something that had been its own kind of turning point. "Your mother," Clara said, after a moment. "She would have done the same thing, different circumstances, same instinct." She got her cane under her and prepared to stand, accepting Ruby's offered hand without making anything of it. She fed people when they needed feeding, and she didn't wait for anyone to tell her it was the right thing to do. "You didn't either." Ruby helped her up and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be better than the silence that had settled in the room, which was the particular silence of something finished and something else not yet begun. The hinge between them, the space where the next thing was already forming but hadn't yet declared itself. Outside, Wade was waiting by the wagon in the cold evening air. He looked at Ruby when she came out, and he didn't ask how it had gone because it was in her face, and it was in the way people were moving in the street around them. Slightly changed from how they'd moved before, carrying something new. "Wick's records are with the panel," she said. "And Pratt's testimony? Everything." She stopped beside the wagon and looked at the street, at Calderwood in the evening with its lamps coming on in the windows and its smoke from its chimneys and its very ordinary, persistent, complicated life going on around them. "He's not done. Don't think he's done." "I know," Wade said, "but the ground shifted tonight." "Yes," Wade said, "it did." He offered her a hand up to the wagon bench, which was not something he'd done before, and she took it, which was also not something she'd done before, and neither of them made anything of it, except that the gesture was there and she felt it in the way you feel small things when larger things have just moved. The wagon moved up the dark road toward the ridge, and behind them Calderwood settled into its evening, and the documents were with the panel, and Gideon Crow was somewhere in the town doing whatever men do when the story they've been writing for 15 years starts being told by someone else. And the cold coming down off the mountain that night felt, to Ruby, slightly less like a threat than it had the night before. Gideon Crow did not go quietly. Ruby had not expected him to. The week after the community hearing, he made 3 separate visits to members of the panel. Horace Gant was not one of them, Horace being the kind of man whose mind, once made up, stayed that way like a stone stays in the ground. And he brought his lawyer and a counter-narrative that attempted to reframe Silas Pratt's testimony as the grievance of a disgruntled employee, and Bertram Wick's field notes as the work of an old man whose precision could no longer be relied upon. He filed a formal objection with the Territorial Land Office that cited procedural irregularities in how the hearing had been conducted. He called in favors from people who owed him, which was most of the county, and for about 10 days it genuinely looked like the machinery he'd built over 15 years might be enough to absorb the damage and keep moving. Ruby watched all of this from the ridge and did not panic, which cost her more than it looked like from the outside. What broke it open was not the panel's recommendation, though that came through in Crow's disfavor at the end of the second week. It was not the Territorial Land Office's formal investigation, though that was opened the same day. It was something smaller and more human than either of those official processes, which moved with the grinding slowness of official processes everywhere. It was Harlan Deeds. Harlan Deeds ran the Calderwood Bank and had been Crow's man for going on 12 years. And he was a man who had made a series of small compromises over that time, each one reasonable, seeming in isolation, each one making the next one slightly easier, until he had arrived at a place that was considerably further from where he'd started than he'd intended to travel. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had chosen convenience over principle so many times that the two had changed places in his thinking without him quite noticing. He came to the ridge on a Tuesday morning that was clear and cold and still, the kind of Wyoming winter morning where the light on the snow looks almost theoretical, too clean to be real. He came alone, which told Ruby something before he opened his mouth. Crow's people moved in company. People who had decided to stop being Crow's people came alone. Ruby was in the kitchen when Wade brought him in. She kept working. She was portioning dried beans for the week's inventory, which was not glamorous but needed doing. And Wade poured coffee, and they all sat down at the kitchen table. Deeds held his coffee cup with both hands and looked at the table and said, "The note on your property. The secondary note that was called in." He paused. "There are problems with the documentation of that note's transfer." Wade said, "What kind of problems?" "The kind that mean the transfer may not have been legal." Deeds was still looking at the table. He was a heavy-set man, around 60, with a face that looked like it had been through something recently. When the note was sold to the private buyer, to Crow, certain representations were made about your payment history that were not accurate. Your account was not in arrears at the time of the sale in the way that was represented to justify the sale price. I signed those representations. He looked up. I knew they weren't accurate when I signed them. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a woodpecker had found something interesting in the pine stand and was making its opinion known. "Why are you telling me this now?" Wade said. Deeds was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been in banking for 35 years, he said finally. "And I've made my share of bad calls, and I can live with that. But Silas Pratt is 25 years old, and he testified at that hearing knowing what it would cost him. And I've been sitting with that for 2 weeks, and I can't—" He stopped, tried again. "I can't let a 25-year-old take the weight of something I started." Ruby looked at him. She thought about what it cost a man like this to sit at someone else's kitchen table and say what he'd just said, and she decided that whatever had brought him here was real enough to matter, even if it arrived late and imperfectly. "What do you need from us?" she said. "Nothing," Deeds said. "I'm going to the Territorial Investigator this afternoon with a written statement. I'm telling you first because you deserve to know first." He pushed back from the table and stood up. He looked at Wade. "The foreclosure on this property was built on documentation I helped falsify. The investigator will have everything needed to void it." He put on his hat. "I'm sorry it took me this long." He left. The sound of his horse going down the road faded and then was gone. Wade sat at the table looking at his coffee cup. Ruby went back to her beans. For a while, neither of them said anything. "He came," Wade said finally. "He came," Ruby agreed. "That's not nothing." "No," Ruby said. "It's not nothing. It's also 12 years late and a lot of damage done to a lot of people." She set down the beans. "But he came. People do that. They come late, and they come imperfectly, and they come when it finally costs them more not to than to." She paused. "That's usually when they come." The territorial investigation moved faster after Deed's statement than it had in the 2 weeks prior. What had been a proceeding weighted with Crow's objections and legal maneuvers became something with a different kind of gravity, the kind that comes when the person who kept the books decides to explain the books. The fraudulent survey filings were confirmed. The cattle scale manipulation, which had affected not just Wade, but 11 other ranchers in the valley over 6 years, was documented through Silas Pratt's ledger pages and 3 other ranchers who came forward once it was clear that coming forward was no longer a guaranteed path to ruin. Gideon Crow was served with papers on a Friday in February on the main street of Calderwood, and the story of it spread across the valley in the way stories spread, in small places where everyone knows everyone and information moves at the speed of horses and strong feeling. Ruby heard about it from Pete Tillman, who heard it from someone in Calderwood, who had apparently been standing close enough to observe the specific quality of Crow's face in the moment the papers were handed to him. Apparently he didn't say a word, Pete said, with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a piece of news. Just took the papers and got in his buggy and drove away. That's it? Earl said. That's it, Pete said. No speech? Nothing. Ruby thought that was probably the most telling detail of all. Gideon Crow had always understood that his power lived in the story he told, about himself, about other people, about who mattered and who didn't in this valley. The papers didn't destroy that story with a single dramatic blow. They just made it impossible to keep telling it, which was a different thing, quieter and more complete. The foreclosure was formally voided in March. The secondary note was ruled unenforceable due to the fraudulent documentation of its transfer. The 3 properties with falsified surveys went into dispute proceedings that would take longer to resolve, but whose outcome was no longer in doubt. The cattle scale restitution, the money owed to 11 ranchers for 6 years of adjusted records, was a calculation that Bertram Wick's office helped tabulate, and Wick did it with the enthusiasm of a man who has found a problem suited exactly to his particular skills. Crow's lawyer left Calderwood. His intermediary businesses in the valley, the ones that had controlled supply access and credit, began to unravel without his presence holding them together, because that kind of structure is never really about the business. It's always about the person at the center who makes it work by being the thing everyone is either afraid of or indebted to. And once that person is gone, the whole apparatus starts looking like what it actually is, which is a collection of arrangements that only made sense in the context of the fear. And into the space that Crow left, things began to fill. Spring on Calderwood Ridge came the way it always did, argumentatively, with weeks of false starts where the temperature dropped back to winter, just when you'd begun to trust the thaw, where the mud made the road impassable for days at a time, and the whole enterprise of living at elevation felt like a conversation with an opponent who kept changing the terms. Ruby did not find this poetic. She found it exhausting and managed it accordingly. But the kitchen garden came back stronger than she'd expected. The soil she and the Tillman brothers had turned and amended through the fall had done what amended soil does over winter. It had settled and improved and stored what it was given, and when the ground softened enough to work in late April, the first seeds she put in took hold with an enthusiasm that felt almost personal. The chickens were 53 now. Margaret held court in the coop with the authority of an elder who has survived things the younger birds cannot imagine, and carries the knowledge of that survival in her walk, which was still lopsided, still slightly heroic. She had become, without Ruby planning it, the unofficial symbol of something. The Tillman brothers made a point of checking on her specifically when they did the morning rounds, and Everett, who did not sentimentalize animals as a rule, had been observed on at least 2 occasions telling visitors about the chicken with the bad leg in a tone that did not match his general view that Ruby's attachment to the birds was impractical. It was Everett who brought it up first, the supper house idea, which was not how Ruby had expected it to happen. He came into the kitchen on a Saturday in May when she was working on what to do with a surplus of eggs, and he stood in the doorway for a moment in the way he did when he had something to say that he hadn't fully decided how to say it, and then he said, "You've had people asking." Ruby looked up from the eggs. "Asking what?" "About food. Whether they can come up here and eat." He folded his arms, which was his posture for delivering information he wasn't sure would be well received. Horace Gant mentioned it to Wade last week. Said people have been asking since the supper whether there's somewhere in the valley that does real cooking. The nearest thing to a proper eating house is the hotel in Calderwood, and that's... He seemed to search for a word. "Functional," he said, which from Everett was a complete dismissal. Ruby set down what she was doing. "People want to come here and eat." "That's what I said." "Wade knows about this?" "Wade's been thinking about it for a month and not saying anything," Everett said with the tone of a man who has watched someone circle something for longer than necessary. "Which is what he does. I'm saying it instead." Ruby was quiet for a moment. The idea wasn't new. It had been in the back of her thinking since the community supper, sitting there not quite formed. She'd dismissed it as impractical, then as too soon, then as something to consider later when things were more stable. And now it was May, and the debt was cleared, and the ranch had its second wind, and Everett was standing in her kitchen doorway being the unlikely messenger for what seemed like the obvious next thing. "The barn," she said. Everett looked at her. "What about it?" "The front section. It's not being used for anything except equipment storage, and that equipment could go in the smaller outbuilding. The space is good. It's big, it's dry, it's got good ventilation." She was already seeing it, the layout of it, the tables and the fire, and what it would take to serve 20 people at once properly. "It would need work." "I can work," Everett said. It was such an un-Everett thing to say that for a second she didn't quite process it. She looked at him. He looked at the wall. "I mean, the barn needs work anyway," he said. I'm not. He stopped. "I just mean the work needs doing regardless." "Yes," Ruby said, letting him have that. "You're right. It does." She talked to Wade that evening on the front porch in the still cold May air, both of them in coats, looking out at the valley below with its patchwork of ranches and farms, and the distant thread of the road into Calderwood, and beyond that, the suggestion of mountains. She laid it out for him. The barn conversion, the capacity, the kind of operation it would be. Not a hotel, not a restaurant in the town sense, a supper house, open 3 evenings a week and Sunday midday, serving what the ranch produced and what the season allowed, at a price that was honest and a quality that was the point. Wade listened in his particular way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's a business," he said. "It is. That's a real business, not just cooking for the hands." "I know what it is," she said. "I've been running the numbers for 3 weeks." "Of course you have." There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite something else. Something that lived in the space between the two. He was quiet again. "Equal partnership," he said finally. "In the ranch and in this. Equal." Ruby looked at him. "You've been good to work for, Wade." "I'm not talking about working for me," he said. He was looking at the valley, not at her, which was either because the valley was the easier thing to look at or because he needed the distance for what he was saying. "I'm talking about equal. The land, the animals, the business, all of it. Equal." Ruby said nothing for several seconds. "That's a significant offer," she said. "I know what it is," he said, which was her own phrase back at her, and she recognized it. "I came here with 47 cents and a crate of broken chickens," she said. "I know what you came here with," Wade said. "I also know what you did with it." He finally looked at her. His face in the evening light was what it always was. Not easy to read quickly, something you had to sit with. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a partnership because you've earned one, and because running this alone is something I'm capable of, but it's not." He stopped. "It's not what I want anymore. If that's something you can—" "Yes," Ruby said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, "equal partnership." Something moved in his face. Not a transformation. Nothing that dramatic. More like a loosening of something that had been held tight for a long time. "We should probably discuss the terms," he said. "Practically speaking." "Probably," Ruby agreed. "But not tonight." "No," he said. "Not tonight." They sat on the porch in the cold evening, and the valley below them went through its late light, the long, slow gold of a Wyoming May evening, where the light doesn't so much set as gradually decide to leave. And neither of them spoke much after that, because the thing had been said, and it didn't need more words right now. It needed the air around it to settle. The barn conversion took 6 weeks. Everett ran it with the organizational precision of a man who has found a project worthy of his full attention, which Ruby had suspected was what he was capable of all along, but hadn't seen until now. The Tillman brothers worked under his direction and complained approximately the right amount for the scope of the work, and produced something that, when it was done, was not beautiful in the way that things in catalogs are beautiful, but was solid and warm and right, in the way that things built by people who understood what they were building for are right. Long tables of pine that could seat 8 each. A wide hearth at the far end that Ruby had designed for cooking at scale. Lamps hung at intervals that put the light where it was needed. Hooks near the door for coats. Floors swept clean and kept that way, which became one of Pete Tillman's self-assigned responsibilities for reasons he never fully explained. The Mercer Supper House opened on a Thursday in July. Ruby had written the date on a piece of paper and put it on the kitchen shelf 6 weeks before, and every morning she'd looked at it, and some mornings it had felt like a destination, and some mornings it had felt like a threat. 12 people came that first Thursday. She had prepared for 20, which meant there was food left over, and leftover food felt in the moment like a small defeat, even though she knew rationally it wasn't. Horace Gant was there, and Clara Aldrin, who had been driven up by her grandson and who ate 2 full portions of the braised chicken and said nothing critical and therefore everything complimentary. Silas Pratt came with his young wife, who was shy and said almost nothing but ate everything on her plate, and when she left told Ruby it was the finest meal she'd had since her grandmother's table in Ohio, which was the kind of specific compliment that means more than a general one. The second Thursday, 19 people. The third, they ran out of food by 7:30 and had to apologize to the last 4 who arrived, which was both a problem and not a problem, and Ruby spent the following week recalculating portions. Word moved the way it moves in places where people's lives are materially connected to each other, and there isn't much else to talk about. By September, the supper house was turning people away on Thursday evenings, and Ruby had added a Wednesday seating and was thinking seriously about expanding the kitchen. Travelers on the main road started coming up the ridge specifically for the food. Ranch hands, merchants, a circuit judge who came twice in the same month, and on the second visit asked if they'd consider opening on Mondays as well. And Ruby said no with the politeness of someone who had learned to protect capacity. The restitution payments from the cattle scale fraud started coming through in late summer. Slow and incomplete at first, because these things always were, but real. The 11 ranchers who'd been cheated received what they were owed in installments that the territorial court had ordered from the liquidation of Crow's local holdings, and the amounts weren't life-changing for any of them, but they were acknowledgement, which was its own kind of thing. Acknowledgement that it had happened. Acknowledgement that it mattered. Gideon Crow had left Calderwood by August. Not dramatically, he'd packed his house and left for somewhere east. Nobody was quite sure where. And the house sat empty for a while and then was bought by a family from Colorado who had no idea about any of it and painted the front door blue and planted a kitchen garden. Ruby thought about this sometimes, about how power like Crow's looked permanent from inside it and turned out to be made of borrowed time and other people's silence. There was a lesson in it that she couldn't quite hold in a single thought. Something about how the structures that seem most solid are often the ones most dependent on no one looking too closely. Something about how silence is the mortar in those structures, and when people stop being silent, the whole thing develops cracks. She was not a philosopher, she cooked, but she thought about it. The proposal, if you could call it that, and Wade would later say it was more of a continuation of a conversation they'd been having for months, happened on an October evening when the aspens had completed their transition and the ridge was in its full autumn state, which was the most extravagant thing this particular landscape did, and it did it without apparent effort. They were in the kitchen after service, which was the 2 of them at the table with the lamps low and the remains of the evening's work around them, and Wade said, in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a declaration, "I'd like to marry you." Ruby was washing a pot. She stopped washing the pot. "I know you didn't come here looking for that," he said. "I know that's not what this started as." "No," Ruby said. "And I'm not asking you to—" He stopped, tried again. He was not good at this, she could tell, and she appreciated the effort in the imperfection of it. "I'm not asking you to want something you don't. I'm saying I'd like it, if you'd like it too." Ruby set the pot down and turned around and looked at him. He was sitting at the table with his coffee and his honest face, and the particular combination of certainty and vulnerability that she had come to understand was his most real register, the one underneath the quiet, the one you only saw if you were paying attention. She thought about the wagon bench on the road up from Calderwood that first day. She thought about the chicken coop at 2 a.m. She thought about everything she'd watched him do and say and not say in the years since she'd arrived with 47 cents and a crate of broken chickens and no plan. He was not a simple man. He was not an easy man. He had a particular kind of stubbornness that had been both the ranch's salvation and its difficulty, and he held things privately longer than was useful, and he had silences that went on past the point of comfortable. He was also the man who had stepped out of a crowd without being asked and said, "That's enough," to a room full of people laughing at her, and then offered her honest work, and then kept his word about all of it for a year without making anything of it. "Yes," Ruby Holloway said, "I'd like that too." They were married in November in the Calderwood Meeting Hall because it was bigger than anything else available and they needed the room. 60 people came. More would have come, but Ruby had drawn a line at 60, not from sentiment, but from logistics, because she was also catering the meal herself, and there is a limit to what one person and a borrowed kitchen can do in a single afternoon, even when that person is very good at it. Clara Aldrin sat at the front row and wore a hat that had clearly been saved for significant occasions, and managed to look both very old and completely appropriate to the moment. Horace Gant stood beside Wade because that is what Horace had agreed to do, and Horace Gant's agreements were not subject to weather or second thoughts. Everett sat in the third row with the Tillman brothers, and he wore a jacket Ruby had never seen before. And he did not cry, but there was a specific quality of stillness in his face during the ceremony that she noticed and filed away in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. Silas Pratt was there. He brought his wife, and this time she was not shy. The food was what Ruby made when she was cooking for people she cared about, which meant it was the best version of everything she knew how to do. Pete Tillman ate more than was reasonable and told everyone who would listen that the biscuits were what he'd been asking the universe for since childhood, which was both an exaggeration and not entirely wrong. Bertram Wick came, which surprised Ruby. He had not been invited, but he arrived with a small wrapped package that turned out to be a surveyor's compass in a case that had his initials on it, and which he said had been his father's, and he wanted them to have it for the property, which was a gift that made no practical sense and was exactly right. The Abelard family came, the 4 children and the 1 horse in poor health. The horse was improved by November, Ruby was glad to see. The supper house ran through the winter, which had not been the original plan but had become necessary because people kept wanting to come up the ridge, and Ruby had never been good at disappointing people who were willing to make the trip. She added 2 staff, a girl from Calderwood named Vera, who was 16 and learning fast, and a man named Hector who had cooked for a mining camp for 3 years and had opinions about fire management that were genuinely useful. Margaret the chicken lived to be 7 years old, which is a respectable age for a chicken and considerably longer than anyone had predicted for her in those first days in the Calderwood livery yard. When she died, in the spring of her 7th year, Ruby buried her at the edge of the kitchen garden and did not make a speech about it, because Margaret had not been the kind of creature who required speeches. She had been the kind of creature who showed up and survived and went about her business with a lopsided determination that made no allowances for what other people thought was reasonable. There was something there, too, something Ruby held without quite stating it, even to herself, about what it meant to keep going when the keeping was hard, about how the things that survive the longest are not always the things built strongest at the start, but the things most committed to the next day, and the one after that. The valley changed over the years that followed in the way valleys do, slowly and not always in the directions people expected, and with the usual human mixture of progress and regression and things that looked like one and turned out to be the other. But the Mercer Supper House stayed. It fed travelers and ranchers and families and the occasional lost stranger who found their way up the ridge road and wasn't sorry they had. It fed people during the hard winter of 1887 when the snow was extraordinary and the road was impassable for 3 weeks, and Ruby cooked everything they had and sent it down to Calderwood by sled. It fed the valley through 2 droughts and a cattle disease and a fire that took the Abelard barn and the subsequent reconstruction of same. It became the kind of place that exists in some communities. Not famous, not celebrated in any formal sense, but known. The kind of place people meant when they said the good place without further specification. The kind of place whose continued existence feels like proof of something, though different people would tell you it was proof of different things. Ruby would tell you it wasn't proof of anything in particular. She'd tell you she cooked food and people ate it, and that was the transaction. And everything else people read into it was their own business. She'd tell you this in the direct, slightly impatient way she had, which people had long since stopped being surprised by. But Wade, if you asked him, and people did ask him, had a different answer. He'd sit with it the way he sat with things, and then he'd say, "She saw something worth saving when everyone else saw something worth throwing away. She kept doing that. That's the whole story." And it was the whole story. Or close enough. The woman who had arrived with 47 cents and no plan. The chickens that everyone said were worthless. The ranch that was failing. The community that had made up its mind. The slow, imperfect, entirely unspectacular process of changing all of it, not through one dramatic gesture, but through 1,000 small ones, made consistently, made even when they were invisible, made especially when no one was watching. There's no clean lesson in this. Life doesn't produce clean lessons, only experiences that sit in you and rearrange something slowly over time. And whether that rearrangement becomes wisdom depends on whether you pay attention to it. Ruby paid attention. She had been paying attention since she was old enough to understand that no one was going to pay it for her. That was the thing nobody who came to the supper house could quite put their finger on. What it was about the place that felt different from other places. What it was that made people feel, sitting at those pine tables in that converted barn on Calderwood Ridge, like something was being given to them that they hadn't known they needed. It wasn't just the food, though the food was as good as people said. It was something underneath the food. Something about the fact that every person who sat at those tables was eating something that had started from almost nothing and been made into more than seemed possible. And you could feel that in it somehow, even if you couldn't name it. Ruby couldn't name it either. She was a cook, not a poet. But she felt it sometimes. In the kitchen on a busy evening with the fire going and the pots working and the sound of people eating coming through from the barn, this specific feeling of things being in their right place. Not perfect. Never perfect. The biscuits burned sometimes. The braise came out thin some nights when the birds were older or the heat was wrong. Vera dropped a whole pot of soup once and cried about it for 10 minutes, and Ruby told her to clean it up and start another one, which was not the most comforting response, but was the right one. But right. In the right place. She was a woman who had once been laughed at in front of a crowd for spending her last coins on something everyone told her was worthless. And she had stood in that humiliation, and she had not abandoned what she saw in it, which was not the chickens, but the scene itself. The ability to look at a broken thing and find the worth in it before anyone else had managed to, and then do the work of proving it. That was the thing she'd always had. The thing no one could take by cutting off supplies or calling in debts or spreading rumors or laughing in a public yard. The thing that had no name, but was hers. Outside Calderwood Ridge, in the direction of the valley, the mountains were doing what they always did, which was standing there being mountains, enormous and indifferent and permanent in a way that human lives are not. But the smoke coming up from the supper house chimney was visible from the valley floor on clear evenings, and people who knew what it meant would sometimes point it out to people who didn't. That's the Mercer place, they'd say. You should go up there and eat. And people did.